All right, today we're going to talk about tables in HTML. And tables in HTML are to handle things like having rows and columns of data. Without these tags, it's difficult to show rows and columns of data. Let me try to demonstrate what I mean by that. I'm going to make just a real quick HTML file here. You'd think I'd have typing this down. I could do it in my sleep. Again, for those of you that have not tried this, this is Visual Studio Code, and it's a nice tool for doing things like creating web pages or also editing in any programming language. Notice how conveniently, if you put a start tag in, it just adds the end tag. So if I do something like this, and I try to get like rows and columns, like let's say I wanted to do baseball standings. Baseball, it's opening day today, right? Or sometime this week. So let's say I wanted to do baseball standings. And I had something like this. I had the team, wins, losses, percentage. And then maybe the team New York, three wins, 0 losses, percentage wins 100%. And I have Cleveland. Should have put Cleveland on top, but hey, this is just for demonstration purposes. And I don't know if these are the right divisions or not. I'm just making this up. So we could go on and on and on, but it would just be more of the same, right? And now, if I go and save this, and I put it on the desktop, and I call it baseball.html, let's say. This isn't going to look the way that I might hope for it to look. I would hope for it to look something like this, right? But if we looked at it, it doesn't look anything like that. Why doesn't new torque? Why doesn't it look anything like the way that I would hope it to look? Because of the way that HTML handles white space. This is one of the first things that we talked about in this course, is that any white space, that is any spaces like this, or new lines, or whatever, get compressed to a single space. So I want to have rows and columns, but I can't space it out just in the HTML code like this, because HTML, the web browser, takes the HTML and reduces any of that white space to just a single space. So how do I get around that? I can create a table tag. All right, I can create a table in HTML. A table allows us to define rows and columns. Now this is different than what we've seen, like as far as the grid view and the flow example that we used in CSS. what was that called? Flowbox? Boy, my memory is not going too well today. Flexbox. Yeah, this isn't what I mean by rows and columns like in grids and Flexbox. I mean rows and columns of actual data. The rows and columns in Flexbox and in the grid mode of CSS are ways of us to align blocks of content. This is a way for us to align specific pieces of data. All right, specific pieces of data. All right, and in order to do that, we have to tell it that we have a table with specific pieces of data. So we do that with a table tag. Tables are, first of all, you have your table, then you're going to have your table row, and then you're either going to have headers or data. So if I put a table tag in, I say this is where my table starts, this is where my table ends. A table is a set of rows. So each one of these is a row. So I'll have 4 rows. And those are TR tags. Now, each one of these is a column or a particular table cell. And table cells can either be THs, which mean they're headers, or TDs, which means that they're data. This first row is headers because there's not a team called team. Team is the header of that column. Likewise, the word wins describes what that column is. Likewise, table header. Likewise, percent. So what is it saying? It's saying we have a table and it contains right now 1 row that has these headings in it. Then we're going to have a table, we're going to have a row for each team. So TR, TD, New York, TD, 3 wins, TD, 0 losses, TD, 100%. Now, these are TDs, these are THs. Why? Because those are headings. And these are pieces of data. I'm going to do some copying and pasting here to save me some typing time. So let me just copy the rows. And now let's view it after we put everything in rows and data cells. Okay, now if we save it and view it, we get our tables and columns. Now, let's notice what's different between the THs and the TDs. And this might not be obvious at first glance. What should be kind of obvious is the THs are bold. So by default, THs in a table are bold. TDs are not bold. By default, THs are centered over the column. So notice we have the word team that's centered over this column. Now, it might not be obvious that wins and losses are also centered. They are. It's just that the data in the column is so short, it's not apparent that wins and losses are, the title wins and losses are centered over that column. The data is left aligned. So this is all the way over to the left. Now, we haven't put any CSS on this at all. And for these examples and these examples only, I'm going to be putting CSS in the same file as the HTML document. All right. Don't think that that's the proper way to do it. I'm just doing it just to keep this example simple and so that we can see everything all in one place. All right. So how big is each column? In this case, it's this wide. In this case, the column is this wide. In this case, the column is this wide. The answer to the question is how big each column is. It is big enough to fit the biggest entry. So if I make a bigger entry somewhere in here, if I add a city with a long name, and I'm going to exaggerate, San Francisco, California. That's 0 and 3 on 0% of their game. That first column will become big enough to hold San Francisco, California. That's without any styling on the table at all. So if we do not style the table at all, by default, the columns will be as big as they need to be to fit the largest entry. So if we made this bigger, if we said it had 30,000 wins or something like that, it would make this column bigger, and so on. I'm going to get rid of California to make it a little more real looking, and we'll notice that the table is going to shrink in size a little bit, but it's still big enough to fit the biggest entry. This is 90% of what you need to know about tables, maybe 80% of what you need to know about tables. The rest is styling and some of the things that we're going to do for accessibility. And we'll take a look at those in a minute. First of all, let's consider styling. One thing that we can do is we can give the table a width. So again, I'm putting the style code right in the HTML page. Please don't do what I do. Put it in a separate file. I just do this to keep it simple so you can see everything all at once. And I can make the table, I can give the table the width that I want it to be. So I could say the width is 600 pixels. That'll make the width of the table 600 pixels. All right. How big does it make the columns then? This is interesting because if you notice, this column is still the biggest column and these columns are still smaller. It makes, if you give just a table, a width to the table, it will make each cell in proportion to the longest entry. So San Francisco, the column from team contains San Francisco as its longest entry. The value for wins is the longest entry. Losses 100%, it'll make it in proportion to that. So the team column is still the widest column because San Francisco is the biggest piece of data in it, and that's bigger than the biggest piece of data in any of these other columns. I can, however, you notice I could make it a percent. Let's make it 40% of the page. All right. Then if you notice, as I make the table or the page, the window rather, bigger or smaller, it makes the table bigger or smaller. Notice, however, it won't cut off anything. So in other words, when I get down to here, it's not going to be able to fit San Francisco going all the way across and keep the 40%. So what it does is it drops down the word Francisco to the next line. And when I finally hit up against Cleveland, even if I make the table smaller, it doesn't cut off anything in the table. So it won't cut off a word or something like that in the table if the table gets smaller than the size that it needs to display the content. And that's a good thing, right? Now, I can give a width to the THs. I could say, for example, that the width of THs are 25%. Now, what is that 25% of? Is it 25% of the entire page, or is it 25% of the table? It is 25% of the table. Specifically, is 25% of the table row. And the table row is 100% of the table, therefore it's 25% of this 40%. So let's save it. Refresh. Now if you notice, even if we make this table, even if we make this big, columns stay the same width. With the one catch is it's not going to cut off any data. Let's make the columns a little wider. Let's make the whole table 70% of the page. Might be easier to see. Notice those columns are the same width, other than when I make the table really small, and then it will not make sure it won't cut off names, so the team title will be a little bit wider than the rest. Now, if you look at this, this is a little confusing, all right, because especially if this were a bigger table, it's not obvious does wins relate to this data or that data. We can change the styling to show it, and we could, for example, make the TD or TH. Let's make the TD. Text align center. Remember, we're using CSS to alter what the browser defaults are. The browser, by default, is going to place the content left align in the TD cell. So I'm going to make it centered so it lines up underneath the THs, which are also centered. Well, that looks neater. And it's obvious that that this column is the column for wins, this is the column for losses. Now, the styling doesn't end there, right? I can do a lot of extra stuff for this. I could, for example, put a border around the table. Let's make it 2 pixels wide, solid, and black. That's going to put a box around the entire table. Let's say if I wanted just a horizontal border under each TR. My mistake. You can't put a border on the TR. You have to put it on the TD. My bad. Hey, it's early. All right. So now we have sort of an underline under each TD. Now, if you notice, there's a tiny little gap between each of these things. So each of the TDs is underlined, but there's a little gap. That can be taken care of by declaring border collapse collapse. There's one continuous line over everything, underneath everything. Now, what if I want the headers to stand out? Maybe I make the background color of those gray. Again, if you're doing things in black and white, you really don't need to worry about matching what kind of gray it is. So I'm going to pick a light gray. So I'm going to say $AA. And we have this. If I wanted a box around each piece of table data, instead of just saying border bottom, I could say border, and that'll put it around in all 4 directions. Make a neat little grid like that. Now notice that's just for TDs. If I wanted the same thing for THs, I could put that on THs. And we have table. What if I want the whole table centered on the page? Well, we can do that the way that we would center any block element, like a header or nav section, or just a plain old section. And how do we do that? We say, and again, it's probably neater to do this with your CSS. Put each rule on its own line. One of my students pointed that out to me a few semesters back, and I try to remember to do that because I think it is easier to read this way. And the browser doesn't care. So if I want to make the table centered, I can say margin 0 pixel auto. And that will center it between the right and the left. As I make this wider, it stretches out, narrower, I stretch it out. Now, what if I don't want What if I want to keep it, even if the page gets small, what if I want to keep it a certain width? I can actually specify a minimum width. And you can do this on any block element. So I could say minimum width 400 pixels. And then, no matter how small it gets, it won't get smaller than that size. And therefore, I won't have the Francisco going underneath it. I'll keep it to one line. So that is a big part of doing tables. There's a few additional features, though, that I want to talk about, as well as some styling. So let's look at this example. Come on. This is a very basic example. Well, let's look at it anyhow. Maybe there's some interesting stuff in it, and maybe we can play around with it more. Let's look at this table, and we'll notice some stuff going on in it. That's the problem. I forgot to save the style sheet for this one. So let's put some style in here. This will be a good example. Notice there's some extra stuff in this example. So this is the basic table unstyled. Pretty much like the other one. The first row contains month, electric bill, gas bill, housing, food. This is a sample budget that a person might have. All right. Notice I have a scope attribute on this. This is very important. So on your assignment, be sure you put the scope attribute. The scope attribute says whether this title applies to the column or to the row. So that header of month applies to this column. So therefore, the scope of this header is the column that it appears in. Same thing with all the rest of it. Now, TH, you could consider that first row or the first column to be sort of the header of the row. In other words, what is this row? This row is April, right? January, February, March, April, and so on. So January is sort of the title of this row. So I made it a TH, and I said the scope of it equals row. The scope tags are very important for accessibility. A person that has vision understands what rows and columns something is in simply visually. So for example, this one, what does it mean? It means the losses for Cleveland, because the eye can line up going across and the eye can line up going vertically. If you cannot see and a screen reader is reading this to you, you have to have a way to point out what column and row it belongs to. And you do that by putting headers on the columns and rows and saying whether that header is a header for that particular column or that particular row. So that's the first thing that's different from this example, in this example. The other thing that you can have on this is you can have a caption for the table that tells you that this table is a sample monthly budget. That's also useful for accessibility because it ties that information of what the table's about specifically to the table. So anyone using a screen reader can tell simply by reading that, by having the screen reader read it, that this is a sample monthly budget. Lastly, we have grouped the rows into a heading section with the T head, a body section with the T body, and a footing section with the totals. So we have T foot to have the totals, the footer of the table, T body to be the body of the table, T head to be the heading of the table. Now, visually, that makes no difference in the way the table looks. Where it makes a difference, again, is for people accessing this with a screen reader. They can easily tell what part of the table they're in, what part is being read to them. But we can take advantage of this stylistically. So let's style this page a little bit more. So I'm gonna put my style sheet inside the page, which again, I do not recommend. Please do not do that, but I just want to have one document so I don't have to switch between documents. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put the table, I'm going to give it a width of 50%, a minimum width of 500 pixels, and I'm going to center it. And let's put a border around it for good measure. Right? And what does that do? It does this. It's a table in the center. It puts a border around it and makes it 50%, a minimum width of 500 pixels. Now I have zoomed in on the screen, so let's change these numbers a bit. Let's make the minimum width 200 pixels. So we can see it get bigger and smaller. It won't get any smaller than that. Okay. Now, the other thing we should put on, well, let's put a border around the PDs. And if you notice, tiny little gap between all of these. How do we get rid of that? We put in border collapse on the table. I nearly always use border collapse because I think it's kind of ugly with that little gap. All right, now let's do something to make sure that this lines up with that. So I'm going to center the table data as well. I probably want the same borders around the THs. So I'll do that. Content's already center aligned, so I don't need to put that in. It wouldn't hurt if I did. Right? I can do something like make sure my T head section, remember that's the headers, that's the first row. Let's give it a background color of a light shade of gray again. And the footer, where the totals are, give a background of maybe a different shade of gray. Maybe I want that caption bigger. I can either just say caption, or I could say table caption. What's the difference between the two? Well, that means that any caption within a table tag will get the style. So I'll make it that big. Okay, getting this table looking pretty nice, pretty spiffy. Now, one other thing we can do is, if you notice, let's say I wanted to highlight our biggest expense. Or I wanted, well, yeah, let's say I wanted to highlight this because that is our electric bill for February. For some reason, our electric bill went really high in February. And let's say I wanted to represent that. I could say, I could assign a class called high bill, and I could assign that class to the things I wanted to highlight. And the way you give a style is by saying dot, meaning class, high bill. And maybe, what could we do here? We could make, keeping with the gray theme, I'll make the background a darker shade of gray. And I'll make the color white, let's say. That way, those particular things stand out as being special. Remember, we have two things that we can do. We can put styles to besides HTML tags. Actually, there's several more than these, but two of the things that we can put rather than HTML tags is we can put classes or IDs. IDs are things that you can only have one thing of the page with that ID. So IDs have to be unique on a page. A Class, however, can be on several things. So since I might want to tag several things as having a high bill value, I put a class of high bill, and then I can assign that to whatever columns and or whatever table data that I want to for this. Now, there's one more thing that's a sort of a neat trick CSS, and that is if I want to get alternating rows. Maybe some of you remember the green bar paper for computers. Let's look up what green bar paper is. Green bar paper. Well, let's just make this big. Green bar paper was paper like this. It had green bars on it. Why do we have green bars on it? That helps the eye know what all is in the same row. Because if you have a big print, it used to be in the old days, if you had a big printout, it wouldn't be clear, like your eye would drift up or down a little bit. So what green bar did is it helped you align going across the page. It would be almost like putting a ruler underneath like a page in a book as you're reading it. Keeps things lined up. But instead of that, it was a green bar. So you could tell, hey, this number is in the white bar, so it's part of this row in the white bar. So there's a way that we can emulate this in CSS. CSS table. Alternate row color. And if we look how to do that, there's several ways to do that. Be very careful if you go to Stack Overflow, by the way. Sometimes there's people that are mean on that website. So something like W3 Schools is usually a little nicer. So what we can do is we can do something like this. I'm going to go and say PR nth child even. So the even number table rows, I'm going to give a different background color to. Now, I only want to do this in the main part of the table, which is the table body. So I'm going to say T body. So within the T body, alternating rows, the even TRs gets this style. And I end up with this. And I hope you can tell the difference between that. Let's make it just a little bit darker, make it even more obvious. Let's make it C2. C2, C2. It's a little bit darker so that you can see that. That is 99% of the things you need to know about. Well, that's probably 100% of the things that you know for tables, except in very rare situations. You can make a table column span multiple rows by using the row span value, and you can make the table span multiple rows by using, or multiple columns by using the call span. So I don't want to put it in my table, but notice that if I do that, I can make this bottom cell span 2 columns by giving a call span of 2, or I could do that in the CSS. No, I wouldn't do that in the CSS. I would do that with the call span attribute. I could do the same thing with row span. It's very rare to do that. And in fact, I would suggest not doing that because that makes the page harder for those accessing it with a screen reader. So I would avoid doing the call span or row span. In this case, what would I do? Well, I just pick the T sum in a TH because it's sort of the heading for that row. Do it that way. I would say that's a better way to do it than that. The other thing I would do is I'd align these to right. So it would make a neat little table. And how would I do that? I could say text align right for table, THs, and TDs. When they're separated by a comma like this, it means this one and this one and this one. So I think that's neater because it shows you the sum going that way. You know, they're lined up in columns. It's easier to see that those are added together. All right. The remainder of the semester, let's see, this is week 12, if I'm not mistaken, which means we have about 3 weeks of classes left. It's amazing, isn't it? And then we have finals week where your final projects are due. So please get started on your final project if you have not already. The remainder of the semester, we are going to discuss JavaScript. And we're not going to do a lot in JavaScript, but we'll do just enough so that you understand what JavaScript is used for and learn some pretty simple, basic JavaScript instructions. So that's all I had for today. Are there any questions? If not, I will see you either in lab or I'll see you next week. Take care. Let me know if you have any questions.